Hello, everyone. This is Pepperfish with Pepperfish Podcast, and I want to start off the new year by actually podcasting again. So I'm hoping now that I bought a little composition book and I'm starting to outline my little podcasts and my thoughts, that I might actually get around to recording them. So I'm here today to actually start doing that. And this is podcast number 5, I believe. So I want to kind of get started by talking about one of my favorite things, and it's stories. So I love stories, I love storytelling, and I love stories in all of the different formats that they come in song, and in movies, and in books, and in video games even. And my tastes have evolved over my entire life, and I kind of just want to go through sort of the long evolution, I guess you could say, of my interests and my enjoyment of stories, and how I've actually sought out and found things to hear about and to learn about, and kind of to explain, I guess, why I like some of the stuff that I do. I realize that some of my taste, I guess not everyone would have the same exact tastes as I do. And so like I said, I just kind of want to start off by kind of giving you 2 bits of information that sort of explain why I choose sometimes to like certain types of stories over others, or certain genres, or certain, certain options, I guess you could say, over others. So, first of all, I have a tendency to get bored, but I'm also someone who will, I'm a heavy consumer, so I consume things heavily, and then I get bored of it, and then I move on. So that's pretty much, just something to keep in mind. I tend to consume, get bored, move on. So, and of course, the consumption may take years, and then I get bored of it quickly, or sometimes not so quickly, but it's happened, over and over again. So that's partly why there is an evolution. I'm not just a true diehard forever about anything. But I always have deep love for all the genres and such that I've, consumed, I guess. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And the next thing really has to do with access. Because I am a heavy consumer, that means I want to have access to large quantities. So sometimes my preferences are indulged better by certain genres or certain formats and such, so that I tend to indulge heavily where I'm able to access large quantities, and therefore am influenced largely by these particular options, I guess you could say. So you may wonder why I'm even talking about this. Basically because, like I said, I really just love stories, and I think this is a big part of who I am, and I think it reveals perhaps a lot about my character. So I, wanted to have a podcast about this, and I'm uncertain of exactly how long this podcast will be. I may end up needing to break it up and to create different smaller podcasts. I already know that there will be offshoot podcasts. There are certain things that I will not discuss today in full, because some things would just deserve their own whole podcast. So that being said, I'm going to get started sort of at the very beginning, my early love of stories, and sort of the most basic, first initial influences on my preferences, I guess. And there's a few at the very beginning when I was in elementary school. Of course, as an American, I was introduced and inundated with American and British storytelling. So that, I was open, I was receptive, I would watch movies 1,000 times if I really loved it. And, I just was open at an early, young age to just the different stories that, we're all sort of familiar with here in America. And I guess you could say I was familiar from an early age with sort of what the tropes are and the cliches and, learning the stereotypes as you're young, I guess you could say. For what we had here in America. So whether that's TV shows or movies or songs or whatever. So added to that, of course, is a brief introduction to anime as a young child. My sister had brought home Vampire Hunter D, and that was like, what is this? And unfortunately, I didn't really have access to anime in as large a quantity at that time. We're talking, like the early 90s here. So I didn't get to indulge at that point. But it is something that I always remembered and kept in the back of my head, is that there is adult-ish cartoons out there that, they're not Disney. As much as I love Disney, there are other options beyond Disney. So, the other early influences, I think, were video games, actually. So, I learned at a young age that as much as I enjoy playing video games, I also really enjoy watching other people play video games, and video games that really have involved stories and, just sort of epic adventures really are very entertaining to me, and I really don't mind sitting for hours and watching someone else play and just learning new things with them and all of that. That being said, part of the fun, of course, of watching someone else play is thinking, okay, when I do it, I will now know what to do and it'll be easier. Another aspect of playing games young was the introduction of computer games, specifically Labyrinth and Myst. And I remember when we got Labyrinth of Time. Labyrinth of Time was a computer game that I think my sister got for her birthday or something like that. And we ended up playing that kind of as a family. So it was a fun experience to play this computer game and to try and figure out the story. And the interesting and I think the important thing about the game of Labyrinth specifically is how bizarre it is. So you take familiar places and familiar settings and certain concepts, and then the game just completely twists it around so that you move from a circus mirror maze into a space station, library, and then you pass through that and you end up in a medieval maze, and then you may find yourself at some point in time in a, detective's office, and then a old western town. So you have all of these different crazy settings, and you're just trying to figure out the storyline, and of course part of the story ends up changing, history changes, and because it's technically the labyrinth of space and time. So it was a great, fun game, but I think part of what made me remember it all these years is just as a story, it didn't feel a need to actually stay within logical bounds. It set it up in a somewhat logical way so that, okay, I'm going, the game makers, I assume, are thinking, I'm going to break the rules here by making this labyrinth outside of space and time, and you're sort of in this sort of strange, surreal world, and when you're in that type of world, you can kind of do anything you want. So I was really attracted, I guess you could say, to this idea of, okay, so I'm kind of used to all these American norms that I've seen in stories, but I found that when you had people going out and breaking down some of these sort of logic barriers or whatever, I found it really interesting and fun. And so I think my next other early important influence is related to this. It's actually, I guess, spiritual stories. So growing up, I was religious and I was a believer. So, and I think it really had an impact on my life and my love of stories. Not that so much that I would hear a biblical story and think, wow, that's great, that's fantasy, that's, magic and power and, heaven versus hell, and that's so interesting. That actually is not, I think, what is the bigger impact on me. As much as I enjoyed my mom telling me, the story of Joseph and the coat of many colors, I did enjoy that story, but that's something that was in a book and, something from a really long time ago. And at that point in time, I couldn't really appreciate the story fully. But what actually did influence me is personal stories of sort of the mix with reality and this sort of spiritual otherworldliness. I remember when I was fairly young, going off to camp, and one of the older women who were there as like one of our camp leaders, I remember her sharing this story about how I think she had like broken her leg or something like that, and she was in the hospital, and she remembers waking up from surgery and being surrounded by demons. And so she's like in her hospital bed, surrounded by demons, and there's this, just this crazy, which to us might, think of, wow, she just came out of major surgery and is, freaking out, or, is sort of delusional, or just having a bad dream. That's sort of what, more realistic interpretation of this story would be. But at the time, as she was telling it, I totally believed her. I listened and I totally believed. And I think that sense of belief was a major influence on myself and my love of stories, because when you believe that something otherworldly could really happen in sort of our normal, everyday, mundane reality, I think that really opens up, for me at least, it opened up for me, a lot of mental possibilities in the world, and I just love hearing stories about sort of the extra normal, or the stuff that's out of the ordinary, and maybe just trying to figure out what was that and what's going on here. So, I would say that those, all of that together was sort of my early love of stories. I loved watching movies, loved watching TV, and, getting little bits of personal stories, and then, getting introductions to early computer games and anime and stuff like that I think really kind of set the foundations. At this time, of course, I was not reading. I had a reading disability. Actually, I still do. But my brain really just did not like reading and trying to understand symbols. And so I'm thinking more of elementary school at this point. So in junior high, this is kind of when the major big transition really happened for me in regards to storytelling and stories. Is that in junior high, I saw this very attractive book at the library, and it was the Redwall series. It was the first book in the Redwall series, called Redwall by Brian Jacks. And I looked at the cover, and I struggled to read the back of the cover of the paperback, and really wanted to read the book. And I didn't actually, that isn't true. I didn't want to read the book. I wanted to know the story. And I remember turning to one of my sisters and being like, why don't you read this? Because I wanted her to read it and then tell me the story. And she actually just said to me, why don't you read it? Oh, so I basically decided that I would. And that book is basically, to a certain extent, my Harry Potter. It was the book that got me reading, and that's what my brain needed to really just sort of do what it needed to do to figure out how it was going to read in the future. And really, it was practice, and I read most of that series and collected most of that series throughout junior high. And I remember being so happy that I could finish, 300-page book over the weekend. I was so happy about that. And those stories were, sort of great high fantasy. They're about a bunch of mice and who live in a monastery, and they, so many passages about really good food. And these crazy adventures that they have, trying to fight off ferrets and stuff like that. And rats and that sort of stuff. So it was a very fun series, and of course fantasy. So I'm definitely interested in any book that kind of touches on the fantastic, of course. So that was a really major turning point in my life, because then I became a reader. So, instead of being limited only to watching TV and watching movies or playing video games, I was now opened up to a whole new world of books. So I definitely continued to read those books, and by the time I was in high school, I was pretty much finally reading at my grade level, and ready for more adult stuff. And of course, by high school, I was definitely the type of kid who did not want to read kids' books or even young adult books. I wanted to read adult books, I was one of those kids. So I definitely, was reading a little bit more of the literature and stuff like that by the time I was in high school. But in the end, most of that stuff didn't really influence me in my love of stories, as certain other things. Interestingly enough, though, also in junior high, I was first introduced to Hong Kong films, and I remember the first time going to see a Hong Kong film. It was in the theater in California. We had to go all the way to San Gabriel, I think, to actually see one of these films, and it was very difficult. It was, honestly, as a junior high kid, I was not really interested in this, police crime drama that I had to read subtitles really, really fast, and, it was not the film for me. And I just remember thinking, Mom, why are you so into this? So my mom and her best friend were really into these movies, and they kept going, and I was just what is this, Of course, in high school. It was in high school where I actually, sat down, obviously at this point I was better at reading, and I sat down and started to watch some of these. My mom had brought, had a few copies of them now on VHS, and I was able to read at my leisure and rewind and try to figure out the subtitles if I had to. And this is sort of the first major, I wouldn't say impact, or first major shift, perhaps, not beyond the format shift that happened in regards to reading as opposed to just watching television, but in regards to methods and, types of storytelling. I don't know, I'm not articulating this very well, but I was so used to American and British storytelling methods and concepts and tropes and cliches and stereotypes. And the Hong Kong films actually introduced me to another type of storytelling, and, in subtle ways, I guess. Learning about new contexts. So, learning about different, different social norms, and, there's a whole other history in these countries that, is happening. And for the most part, a lot of it, I would have a vague sense. Okay, I know this film, this takes place during Vietnam. So I know, somewhat about Vietnam at that time. Of course, most high school students do. Vietnam conflict specifically. So, okay, this movie takes place during that time period, and these characters go to Vietnam from Hong Kong, and so it's like, okay, I have some context, but now I'm actually seeing things from the perspective of, a filmmaker out of Hong Kong who's telling the story, and it's not, the American perspective, it's, it's the Hong Kong perspective. So it was very eye-opening to kind of start to see that type of perspective, and also to be introduced to different types of cliches and cultural norms that are sort of looked at and introduced in these films. Of course, fully realizing that, film is not necessarily reality, but it's definitely there. The differences are there in, the subtleties. But I think one other thing that was really important in regards to watching films from Hong Kong is actually watching some of their fantasy type stories. A lot of the historical, types of stories where you would have people flying through the trees and throwing, demonic power via long pieces of fabric, at people. And this is totally, a normal thing. I actually felt a great sense of freedom to imagine my own context in a lot of the fantasy stories because, I couldn't necessarily identify with any of the okay, let me rephrase that. With a lot of the more modern stories that take place in contemporary times, I have a much better sense of the context, cars and that sort of thing. But when you take a story and you put it back into the past, and it's a past that I'm not as familiar with, it definitely sort of opened up the storytelling, particularly when they start adding these fantasy elements. And in a way, it was very important for me to really hear and listen and be a part of the story, but also not quite completely understand everything that was going on. Not the full context of the situation that most people in Hong Kong and China would automatically get. I wasn't getting that. And I didn't necessarily, it wasn't so much that I didn't know that I wasn't getting everything in the story, but I think a part of it was an actual enjoyment of the fact that here's a story and I don't completely know the context, and I feel a strong sense of freedom to imagine my own context to a certain respect. And I think that's an extremely important point for me, and my love of stories is watching a story unfold. And for me, I guess it's the beginning of my own sense of ownership and my own sense of my own need, I guess, instead to say, to be a storyteller. So, and to come up with my own, maybe this is the better solution or the better way to handle this, which, is completely subjective. One thing that I have learned, though, I think this is one of the key examples, is that both the sense of freedom in not knowing and then the learning are both key points. So, to be a little bit clearer, there's this great movie called Bride with White Hair, and I remember watching this movie and just being like, wow, this is, a crazy love story, and, oh my gosh, and this was so good, and I totally loved it, and did feel that sense of freedom, in regards to sort of how I want to interpret the story. I could interpret it any way I wanted, and to a certain respect. But over time, I learned more about sort of past beliefs, I guess, or old mythology in China in regards to demons who could switch gens, which is a motif that you see in the film, and I didn't know anything about that when I first watched it. But it's something that I learned about as I got older and started studying the culture a lot more and its history. So, and that, that totally, makes so much more sense. And, I get the movie better now. And I enjoy the fact that I did initially feel that freedom to interpret it any way I wanted. And then to learn actually what the filmmaker's intentions, and sort of perhaps the more appropriate interpretation. And I like having both. I like having both options. And I think one thing about Hong Kong films, like I said before, this is what made them so interesting and allowed me to enjoy them so much, is the freedom I felt, but also the sense of wonder and learning about new cultures whose social norms are very different than ours. And particularly, it was very interesting to see another culture and to see their areas of political correctness and what they consider to be politically correct and what they don't, what they have yet to, or what they just don't seem to care about in their films. I specifically remember in a lot of the modern day Hong Kong films, this is of course during the 90s, how they would make jokes about AIDS victims like left and right, and not necessarily even about AIDS victims specifically, but about AIDS. And, just out of nowhere, you're just like, what? Like, you could never get away with that here in America. But they were, at that time, they were totally getting away with it in Hong Kong. And so that was kind of like, sort of just that young person, sort of really awakening to the different cultural norms that exist and social norms that are different in other countries. I think the other big thing at this time, because my interest in Hong Kong films really was at its strongest in high school. The other big thing in high school, now that I was a reader, was romance novels. So I remember my sisters read them when they were younger, and one of my sisters would tell me the stories. And as a joke, one Christmas, I decided to give one of my sisters a romance novel, and not just any romance novel, like the supermarket checkout stand, I'm going to get this cheesy romance, like that type of romance novel, And it was Pirate by Connie Mason, and I remember giving it to her for Christmas while she went off to college. I don't think she ever read it. And like the next year, like next Christmas when she came back down, she had it with her, and I was like, you know what? Give it to me, I'll read it. So in high school was when I was introduced, not to like the really chaste, like Harlequin romance novels, but I was introduced to the hardcore bodice ripper type of romance novel. So, and this was also kind of a major impact on me, because it was total smut. And this was, just sort of my introduction to cheesy historical bodice rippers and sort of the tropes and norms that you see there. And I remember specifically thinking about how, I remember being amazed that this book could encapsulate everything that women wanted. Like, it blew my mind. I was like, oh my gosh, a romance novel. And it didn't, like, click for me in my head originally that, oh, that's what romance novels are. That's what they do. They present the fantasies for females, But I was just like, oh my gosh, this novel, like, covers all these things that women desire, supposedly according to American stereotypes and such, and tropes and cliches. Here they are. It's encapsulated in one book. I was blown away, and it wasn't until I was thought about it a little bit more when I was like, oh yeah, of course, that's a romance novel. That's what they do. But this was the beginning of my interest in romance novels, and the interest particularly in the articulation of female fantasy in all of its many forms. And it was also at this time, it was, maybe a year later, I think I read Pirate like in 10th grade or 11th grade. I think it was 11th grade. And then in 12th grade, I was introduced to my first erotica, which was the Sleeping Beauty trilogy, which is essentially S&M, and I realized that I'm not really into S&M, even at that age, but I still read it. And I think erotica definitely had its own impact on me in that, as someone who used to be extremely religious and was a believer, like I said, and at this point was moving away from that sort of religious life and religious need to be chaste and all of that, and to think, must not think perverted thoughts. I was definitely moving away from that type of mentality. And so the introduction of erotica was, and particularly the Sleeping Beauty trilogy, was kind of interesting because one of those instances where, I felt like I was I'm no longer a prude like I used to be. And then in reading that erotica trilogy, finding out that, okay, I actually was still very much a prude, and there's a certain amount of desensitizing that happens when you just read so much, just over and over again. And I remember specifically, thinking at that age that, cunnilingus was not something that, oh yeah, that's fine for other people to do, but nobody ever needs to do that to me. And then by the end of reading that trilogy, I specifically remember just being like, yeah, that doesn't seem like that big a deal. Sure, go ahead. That was definitely more of my mentality. But it was interesting, I think, because, romance novels were definitely an impact and something that held my interest for a very long time. But at this point, I was really just beginning my interest in them and all that they could provide. I actually am planning on doing a whole other podcast about my thoughts about romance novels and all of that. So I plan on not continuing on in that vein, completely describing the ins and outs of my adventures and misadventures in romance novels and erotica, because that is its own whole podcast. But I guess at this point, I just realized I've been talking for about 30 minutes or over 30 minutes, so I'm going to stop the podcast here and say that this is going to be part 1 of my Evolution of Storytelling Love podcast. So, and I'm about halfway through, I guess, more or less, yes or no. So just to recap really quickly, started out with a young love of stories in general, particularly American and British, because that's what I was exposed to. Interest in sort of the spiritual and surreal and any sort of story that kind of breaks out of, out of the cliches that I was already being exposed to. Definitely a love and once I was able to read, a love for reading that came, and then the strong freedom that I felt in watching Hong Kong films and stories from other countries where I didn't always understand everything that was going on. And then, of course, the introduction of romance novels. So that's kind of all that I've covered so far. And all of it really just kind of, I hope this is what I'm articulating, just sort of an evolution over time of my expanding interest and expanding exposure to different formats and genres and that type of thing. So that's it for now. I'm going to close out this particular podcast and hope to finish up in my next one. All right, bye.